dressed for the heat. If you follow along the lectionary, and I know some people actually do, I'm not the only one who does this, some people actually do this, and you look ahead to see what the readings are going to be for the coming Sunday, you might notice on occasion there are parentheses around a certain part of the verses or the numbers in the citation. That means it's optional. It means you can read it if you want to, but you don't have to read it. I'm of the mindset that says if they put it there in the first place, you ought to read it, even if it makes the gospel longer. Sorry, Barbara. Because they chose it for a reason. And there's usually a good reason why you would include it. Well, today was one of those occasions, and that I think you could tell as you heard the gospel there are two distinct parts to it. And you might wonder, how do those two parts even go together? Why are they put in the same thing? And no verses are skipped. Jesus does actually go from one to the other, but it seems an odd pairing of the two. And so the option was to leave out the first one altogether. But I think it's important to hear that first one because of what the second half of the gospel says. And you might be thinking, well, tell us about that. Well, I'm about to tell you about that. But we have to go back a little bit beforehand for the first part to make a little more sense. Jesus had just been talking with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees had been complaining about the Gentiles and the Jews commingling, and the Gentiles ritually defiling the Jewish people because of their presence, because they don't wash their hands, because they eat food that's unclean, and the list goes on and on and on. And Jesus hears this, and he has enough of it. And he kind of moves away. The Pharisees are still there. They can still hear what Jesus is saying, but he speaks to the disciples, and he says, it's not what goes into the body that defiles, but it's what comes out. And the disciples come over to Jesus, as you heard, and said, well, you know the Pharisees are pretty upset about what you just said. And he says, I realize that, but they don't understand. The Pharisees like to say things that make them look good. They like to say things that put them above other people, and they like to tell the other people how they should live their lives like them, even though they're not very honest and truthful all of the time. And Jesus says, don't worry about that stuff. All those rules about the things that go into the body, that's not what defiles. That's not going to harm you. Whether you eat with unwashed hands or washed hands is not going to defile you. Kids, still listen to your parents, though, about that. That's not the point. The point is what comes out, what sits in your heart. If there's those dark places or those bitter places within you, if you've been hurt, whatever it may be, words matter, and your actions matter, and what you say matters. That's what defiles a person. And he gives the list there, of course, but we all know it, especially in this age of social media. We can see it and read it. It's not just what we say, it's what we write too. It's how we respond. It's those words that come out from those other places within us that defile. And we need to be aware of that. And Jesus is saying, you need to speak from a place of love. Speak from a place of love to the other people. Now, even that's hard, because we can speak from a place of love, and those words are still hard to hear sometimes. We can speak from a place of love, and others may not hear it that way. But we have to do it anyway. We have to speak from that place that doesn't defile ourselves, doesn't put others down. And Jesus says all this in the earshot of the Pharisees, so they're hearing this. And then he goes on to the next episode, and we're told that he moves. He moves to another region, and we're told that because he's moving to a region that is filled with Gentiles, or foreigners, or what would just simply be non-Jewish people. And he goes there, and he's approached by this woman. We're told a Canaanite woman, which again specifically tells us that she is not Jewish. And her daughter is sick, and she comes with this demand. And what's interesting is it seems like Jesus just told the Pharisees, just told the disciples, don't make these distinctions between people. Don't worry about the stuff that goes in. Don't worry about Jews and Gentiles eating together. That doesn't matter. It's what we say, what comes out of us, that matters. And then he goes and he tells this woman to stop bothering him. And it seems to be very contradictory, doesn't it? It seems like, Jesus, did you listen to the own words you just said? But I think Jesus is intentional in what he does. It's not to put her off, it's to challenge her, to see how she will respond. And she more than lives up to that challenge. And he says, I can't be bothered. I need to deal with the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And she persists and says, heal my daughter. And Jesus says the line that we probably all remember, it's not right to give the children's food to the dogs. And she comes back and says, I'm not asking to be the privileged ones. I'm not asking to be in the place of God's chosen people. I'm just asking to have a seat at the table, or literally eat what falls from the table. I just want to be a part of it, because there are those of us out here who hear what you have to say and are believing in what you have to say. And so she answers brilliantly and says, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. I will be happy just with that crumb. And Jesus, knowing she rose to the challenge, says, how great your faith is. And he heals her daughter. And what's interesting about this story is there's never been a time, what we've read so far in the gospel, where Jesus refused to heal somebody. Didn't matter if they were Jewish or Gentile or what, Jesus still healed them. Here he puts a challenge in front of her because he wants to hear what she has to say. And she answers it beautifully, and that's a turning point in Jesus' ministry, where he now knows that there are others outside the house of Israel who will listen to his word. Now, Matthew deals with it a little differently than some of the other gospelers, such as Mark, who then begins a whole Gentile mission from this point on. Matthew doesn't exactly do that, but Matthew says, all are welcome to come along. And remember, a couple weeks ago, the gospel we would have had on the Feast of the Transfiguration, if it had been a normal Sunday, would have been the feeding of the 5,000. Often, scholars will refer to that feeding as a Jewish feeding because 12 baskets representing the 12 tribes of Israel were taken up at the end of that feeding. Well, Jesus will go on from this point after today's episode, after this encounter with a Gentile woman, and we'll have another feeding, what we call the feeding of the 4,000, which is often called the Gentile feeding, because 7 baskets are taken up at the end of this, representing the perfect number in the Hellenistic culture. Jesus moves from one way of thinking to another. It has opened up a whole new field and area for Jesus to understand that others can come and be welcomed. And we hear as much in the prophet Isaiah this morning. Isaiah says that God says, and the foreigners, again, foreigners, non-Jews, and the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants. These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. I think it's pretty clear what is meant there. And Jesus comes, yes, to focus on the lost sheep of Israel, but learns along the way that there are others. And he calls us and everyone to the table. And he'll die not just for us, but for everyone. Jesus will come to bring everyone to that house to say, yes, this is a place to gather together to worship. The psalmist writes, for you judge the peoples with equity and guide all the nations upon earth. Let all the peoples praise you. And we gather here today to do just that, to join with one another, whatever our background may be, to join our voices together in worship, to be together and to be mindful of Christ's words, that what we say matters and what we do matters, that we are called to follow the example of Jesus' godly life. May we listen to our own hearts so that what we say may be true, may be from that place of love as we gather together to praise God.